I'd like to introduce Bill Gale, who's from the Brookings Institution. We appreciate you giving us some time this morning. We know you're busy, and he's actually going. You're leaving like right to the airport after this, aren't you? Yeah. So thank you, Bill, for finding some time to talk to us about your book. Thank you.
I'm going to keep telling him to turn the temperature down.
Okay, great. I've stopped taking clothes off, so the only option is for the temperature.
We're very informal. You can keep going.
All right, well, thank you. It was a pleasure to be here. And when Karen asked me to do this, I was more than happy to do this. As Thad said, this is the product of a book that I wrote with the title on the screen. People's first reaction is usually, oh, that's a great title. And then I have to tell them, well, my wife thought of the title. I didn't. And then the book itself is kind of aqua colored, teal colored with red lettering on it. And then people say, oh, it's a great cover. And I say, well, you know, Oxford did that. I had nothing to do with that. And they say, well, it's really well written. And I said, well, I hired an editor. And they're kind of like, well, what did you actually do? You know, it feels a little bit like stone soup. I just pulled it all together. But basically, when you write if you read a book about how to write a nonfiction book, they tell you, give the conclusion first. Don't hide the ball. You know, tell the reader where you're going. So in this one slide, I'll tell you the whole book. To start out of the book on the public debt and the problems we face with rising public debt. And then I realized you can't just change the public debt. You can only change it via some tax policy or some spending policy. So that led into investigation of the way we tax and the way we spend. And it turns out there's a problem there too. I mean, the federal government, you can pick up almost any rock and look under it and find a problem. But the two rocks that I picked up were rising debt and the composition of spending and taxes. So our taxes are inefficient, they're inequitable, they're complicated, and the way we spend, as we'll show in a second, is very simple. We're spending increasing amounts on transfers to the elderly and declining amounts on investments. And if you think about like what the spending structure of a healthy economy should look like, it would be the opposite of that. So the first half of the book kind of lays out those concerns and why they're concerns. The second half of the book proposes a solution. I don't like books that are all solution and no statement of the underlying problem. And I really don't like books that spend 300 pages describing the problem and then 5 pages putting forth a solution. So I wanted to take the solution as seriously as I took the statement of the problem. So there's eight chapters that go through various foreign spending, foreign taxes. They go through various major components of the federal budget and how they should be reformed. And taken together, I argue that this package would improve the growth rate, reduce inequality, increase mobility, and bring the budget back into line. So the three-part solution here is first, controlling entitlements. There's no way to get around the fact that Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid take up an enormous amount of the budget. You can cut education or commerce or big bird all you want, or foreign aid. It's just not going to make a difference. So controlling entitlements without destroying them. We don't need to kill Social Security to save it. We just need to reform it sensibly. Same with Medicare. There are changes we can make that could increase coverage, reduce costs in healthcare, and that's what we should be doing. The second component of the, quote, solution, unquote, is actually raising the debt to pay for a big new investment initiative. You can think of this as going long on America. We need to invest more in children's programs, which, by the way, includes things like affordable daycare, but is in particular early childhood interventions. We need to invest in human capital. And then on the physical side, we need more and better infrastructure, and we need substantially more research and development efforts. Now that's all great, everyone can get behind that, but the problem is you have to pay for that. And so the answer is we need to raise and progressively reform taxes. Progressively reform is a polite way of saying raising taxes on the well-to-do, and I'll talk about ways to do that. Okay, but before we get there, let's just go back in our history a little bit. This is the ratio of net federal debt to GDP. One of my bugaboos is when people use gross debt. We should be using net debt to look at these issues. Basically, until 1980, we had a very simple story. Debt only went up during wars or depressions, and then debt came down when the war ended and the depression ended. Between 1980 and now, we've had a series of particular events. Reagan cut taxes and raised military spending. That boosted debt during peacetime for the first time ever. Congress didn't like that, so they enacted a whole series of bipartisan budget deals in the 80s and 90s that got the debt back under control till about 2000. Then we had sort of the perfect storm of Bush's tax cuts, Medicare Part D, wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, a slow economy, and then the Great Recession where the bottom fell out of revenues. Then Obama's stimulus package added some, but not that much. There were a few budget deals, and then Trump's tax cut and the spending deal in the last few years have basically sent us back up. So we're on this upward trend. Debt right now is the second highest it's ever been, well, the highest it's ever been, except for a few years around World War II. And that's the good news. The bad news is where we're headed. This is based on a projection that I've done, and I've done these for years, these shadow budgets for years with Alan Auerbach. This is the latest version. There's three things to note about this projection. First, the most obvious thing is debt goes to higher levels than it has in the past. Second, what's probably more troubling than that is this is a permanent change. This is a sustained, permanent is strong. There's nothing in life is permanent, but this is a sustained change. There's no war that's going to end and bring this back down. There's no recession that's going to end and bring the debt to GDP ratio back down. We're just in a period of sustained differences between taxes and spending that are so big that they're causing the debt to grow and to grow continuously, continually. And the third thing, which is not evident from the graph, but I'll mention that these are based on fairly optimistic economic and political assumptions. So the economy grows at a steady rate, the interest rate stays way below the growth rate, there's no big wars, there's no big recessions, policymakers are relatively restrained in their changes, their policy actions. So this, as a baseline, it could be a lot worse than this, but this was the kind of the baseline that we settled on. I should mention there are judgment calls involved in this. You have to choose a growth rate for 30 years if you want to project a budget 30 years. You have to choose what normal policy is. All right, and we can talk about that more if you want, but just to be clear, this is not fact. These are projections. But if you feel uncomfortable with the long-term assumptions or the long-term projections, this graph is for you. What this graph shows is the full employment deficit. Deficits, of course, depend on policy as well as the state of the economy. In a strong economy, revenues are higher, spending is lower, so deficit is lower. What the full employment deficit does is normalize the state of the economy so that you can see what the policy stance is. And you can see our current full employment deficits are really high, 5% of GDP. That's this year, right now. And depending on what you assume about what policymakers do in the future, it's going to either stay high or it's going to get even higher. All right, we've never had a period in our history, except maybe World War II, where we've had sustained full employment budget deficits. All right, so again, this tells you we're on a path here that's just different than the temporary fluctuations in the full employment deficit or the temporary fluctuations in the debt to GDP ratio that we've seen in the past. Okay, let's look at what's causing this. I want to look at it in two steps. First, the changing composition of spending. I'm not going to show you the changing composition of revenue because it's not changing. It would just be 4 flat lines. But the action is in spending. Social Security and healthcare are rising. Healthcare inexorably as the number of each of the oldest age categories keeps getting bigger and healthcare costs keep going up. Social Security peaks at about the time that the youngest boomers turn 65, and then or 75 actually, and then it kind of flattens out after that, which makes sense. But both of them are going up significantly from their current spending, and then net interest is going up significantly. This is based on CBO's interest rates assumptions. CBO just reduced their interest rate assumptions dramatically. These are based on those reduced numbers. Okay, but net interest rate goes up, net interest payments go up, both because debt rises and because the interest rate, even though it's lower than it was before, is projected to rise over time. So everything else the government's doing is falling. Non-defense discretionary spending is a technical way to say investment. Defense is defense, and other mandatory, that means besides Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, that's basically the safety net. The safety net is declining, investment is declining, transfer to the elderly are going up, and net interest is going up. And the gist of the spending proposals in the paper is to shift that around, to try to contain Social Security and Medicare spending and try to boost investment and safety net. And you can see, because of the relative numbers, that a relative small saving in healthcare and Social Security can pay for relatively large percentage increases in investment and the safety net. Okay. All right, so that's just projections. That's just the situation we're facing. Let's talk briefly about the effects of debt on the economy. I want to be clear, not all debt is bad, right? Just like a household can take a mortgage to buy a house and raise your family, and that makes perfect sense. There are reasonable reasons for the federal government to take on debt. The two most obvious ones being to fight a war. I'm sorry, well, three most obvious: fight a war, fight a recession, or make investments. But we've seen in the past that we've done that, especially with respect to wars. But that's not what's happening in these pictures that I've showed you. What's happening is we're borrowing more, we're financing current period consumption with it. And that's a problem, and the problem can arise in two ways, gradually or suddenly, based on this, similar to the way the Hemingway character described the way he loses wealth in The Sun Also Rises. So let's take the sudden scenario first, because that's the real splashy one, and I want to kind of take it off the table. All right. The sudden scenario is something happens, there's investors freak out, they take their capital out of the US, interest rates spike, exchange rate plummets, and there's a huge capital outflow from the country. And this happens when countries like Argentina get in an inflationary spiral or something like that. And it happened recently in Greece. But it's not likely to happen for the United States. People often warn you, if we let the deficit rise, let the debt rise, we're going to have a crisis. Okay, I don't think that's true. We can pay our debts for decades. The projections I showed you, we can easily finance them out of GDP. And we borrow in our own currency, unlike some other countries. So if we needed to, we could try to inflate, but we won't need to when it turns out inflating doesn't work. But it's just not going to happen in the US. We're the strongest financial center. In 2008, we created a financial crisis and sent it out to the rest of the world. And they responded by sending money to the US because we were a safe place to invest. So that's not going to cause them to take their money out. It's hard to see how a gradual rise in debt is going to cause that. Having said that, policymakers could create a crisis. For example, if they don't raise the debt limit when they're supposed to. So the onus is still on policymakers not to do stupid things. But the point I want to make is, even if there's not a crisis, there's still a concern. It's just a gradual one. rather than an immediate one. All right, the gradual scenario is what my former colleague Charlie Schultz used to refer to when he used to say that deficits are the termites in the woodwork, not the wolf at the door. And what he meant is that deficits will slowly eat away at the foundation, and gradually you'll find yourself with a less strong, a weaker, less stable structure of an economy than you had before. And the argument is real simple. I'll go through it real quick. We can talk about this more if you want. But basically, if the government borrows more, that reduces national saving. Once a country has reduced national saving, it's reduced future national income. Just like if a household reduces their saving, they've reduced their future national income. Now that can happen for the country in different ways. Interest rates could go up, or capital inflows could increase from overseas. But either way, if you work through the numbers, once national saving falls, future national income falls. All right, and there's an enormous amount of formal evidence on this. I won't go through it, obviously, but that's the concern. That's the gradual concern. All right, so then if we think that's the concern, or we think the debt trajectory is too high, we've got to come up with what we think the debt target ought to be. Like if you don't like 177, you can't say, well, that's too high and stop. You can if you're not writing a book. If you're writing a book, you have to actually have an answer. So this is probably the single hardest thing to think about in fiscal policy, is what the right optimal debt ratio is. And let me just give you a couple of things, a couple of ways of framing it, because ultimately it depends on value judgments as well as the analysis. Why might you want a higher target debt to GDP ratio? Well, one issue is that the baseline projections are so high at 177 that cutting it down a lot is going to create significant cost. I mean, cutting it means raising taxes, reducing spending. So you might say, well, we don't love the path we're on, but changing it would be even worse. The cure is worse than the disease. A second reason you might want a higher target debt to GDP ratio is that interest rates are low. So the government can bear more debt. The same amount of net interest payments can cover more higher debt if interest rates are low. The considerations going the other way concerning why you might want to seriously cut the debt to GDP ratio from its projected levels are the crowd-out effects that I mentioned. And then one of the arguments about pushing debt to the future is that future generations are going to be better off than we are. So they'll have more income so they can afford it. So there's kind of two responses to that. One is, thank God future generations didn't do that to us, right? But the other thing is, it's not obvious anymore that future generations are going to be better off than we are. What this graph shows is a table taken out of a paper by Raj Shetty and co-authors, where they looked at income of kids and their parents over a long period of time. And this is based on tax records. They found that children born in 1940 were about 90% likely to have higher real income as adults than their parents did. And then the number trails down, and it gets to the point where people born in the early 1980s, only about half of them had higher income as young adults than their parents had. And so that suggests that a lot of people are lower income than their parents. And what's going on there is that although incomes are rising generally, the income distribution is spreading out. So more people are ending up with less income than their parents over time. Now you can see this in other things too. The home ownership rates among 20, 30-year-olds are much lower than they used to be among 20, 30-year-olds. Net worth accumulation among them is not as good as any generation since 2001. If you look at what's called educational mobility, the share of people that have more education than their parents is going down. The share that people who have less education than their parents is going up. So there are a variety of concerns, but anyway, the point is we shouldn't just blithely dump debt burdens on future generations. All right. So in the book, I aim for 60% of GDP, I can't prove to you that that's the right number. I'll present to you, it is impossible to prove that anything is the single right number. So I'll give you a couple of numbers here. The fiscal gap, which is the way we measure the size of the changes, is basically saying if we were to start in 2021 and make an immediate and permanent change that's a constant share of GDP, how big would that change have to be to reach the target? Okay, so the way to read the first line is if we start in 2021, we want to get to a debt ratio of 60% by 2049, we would need tax increases or spending cuts of 4.4% of GDP. All right, that's basically the equivalent of half of all income tax revenues. So imagine everyone's income tax payments going up by 50%. All right, now you might say that that's a really high number, and I would agree with you. That's part of the point of that we're in a fiscal hole. If you only wanted to get the debt to GDP ratio to 100%, then you would need about 2.8% of GDP, all right, which would be then about a 30% increase in income taxes. It wouldn't have to be income taxes, but just to give you a sense of how big that actually would be. Now you might think, well, policymakers probably aren't going to get their act together by 2021, so what if they wait till 2025 to start? And then it goes up a little bit, and instead of 2.8, it's 3.2, okay? Another way to look at this is to say, well, instead of looking at the debt, why don't we look at net interest payments, since that's sort of the ongoing carrying burden of the debt. And so I presented the target as suppose we want a debt level so that net interest payments in 2049 equaled the highest share of GDP that they ever had in the history of the country, which is 3.2%, which occurred in 1991. So under those circumstances, the gap would be 2.7. So again, it's like a 30% increase in income taxes. All right, so these are significant gaps, however you look at it. Usually when people see these, they start thinking about clever solutions that won't work. Cutting foreign aid, as I mentioned, won't work because although people think it's 40% of the budget, it's actually 1% of the budget. Inflation won't work for a variety of reasons. The main one is that Social Security, Medicare are either explicitly or implicitly indexed for inflation. So inflating the price level won't reduce the real value of those costs. Tax cuts, most of you are not from DC, so pardon my diversion here, but in DC you have to explain that tax cuts do not raise revenues, and therefore we cannot tax cut our way to fiscal responsibility. And then economic growth is everybody's favorite choice. Let's just grow the economy more. Politician says, well, I'd like to grow it at 4%, and someone else says, no, I'd like to grow it at 5%. And we all smack our heads and say, oh, why didn't I think of that? Yeah, if you can grow it at 5%, great. But it turns out that higher productivity growth, higher growth rates don't generate as much of a budget solution as you would like them to. The TBO calculates that if the productivity growth rate is higher by a 0.5 percentage point, that means if it's like 30% higher than it's currently forecast to be, then that would shave about 38 percentage points off the debt to GDP ratio. So that's an enormous increase in productivity, sustained over 30 years, would still leave us with a debt to GDP ratio like 140% or something like that. The reason growth doesn't work to reduce the debt more is twofold. One, if productivity growth accelerates, interest rates will go up, and that raises net interest payments. And the other is, if wages go up, Social Security benefits go up, and that also works in the opposite direction. So growth would help. I'm in favor of more growth, but it's not a magic elixir, and we will actually have to do something serious. So there are many serious things we could do. The book proposes one set of things. I'll just touch on a couple of things. In Medicare, so the healthcare problem is a problem in all healthcare, not just government spending. Government healthcare and private healthcare rising at basically the same rates, except Medicaid is rising a little more slowly. But the problems are endemic to the healthcare system, not just to Medicare. And so that's one piece of bad news. The other piece of bad news is you can't give Medicare patients one standard of treatment and give every private patients a different standard. Medicare patients go to the same doctors, the same hospitals, they use the same MRI machines, they get prescribed the same medicine, etc. So you could save a lot of money if you gave Medicare recipients 1980 quality health care in 2019, but you can't do that, basically. So those are the two pieces of bad news. The good news is that Medicare is so big, such an important part of the healthcare industry, that if the government, and the government has leverage over Medicare, if you can change things that Medicare does, you can get the whole healthcare industry to follow, okay? So moving to more competition, to premium support, changing provider payment reform, all of that is really helpful. Letting Medicare negotiate the drug prices and formulary would save a couple $100 billion over 10 years. Right now, Medicare pays 24% more than VA, for example, for the same items, the same pharmaceuticals, which doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. Social Security, I'll just highlight, I was on a bipartisan policy commission reform panel a couple years ago. We came up with a plan that, like everyone else, raises the full retirement age, indexes benefits, extends the payroll tax cap, and then we tried to make the annual benefits more progressive and raise payroll taxes in the process. I mentioned earlier we don't have to kill Social Security to save it. It's really important that we don't kill Social Security. 90% of seniors depend on for at least 2/3 of their income, no, for at least 1/3 of their income, and half of them depend on it for 2/3 of their income. Okay, so it's a very important component of retirement. I'm saying that backwards. 1/3 of the elderly depend on Social Security for 90% of their income, and 2/3 of Social Security depend on Social Security for half of their income. Okay, sorry, I flipped the numbers. All right, investing in the future. One of the things I learned in the book is that the take-up rate of major federal programs is extremely low. Housing assistance, energy assistance, TANF have take-up rates around 25%. So if we could just get the money to people who are eligible for it, we could make a big difference. In the book, I carve out 1% of GDP that we could spend to strengthen social policy. I have in mind investing in early education, child care, job training, and so on. But I think there's room and need for a major investment program in the country. And then infrastructure, I'll just add my favorite anecdote from all of this, the research I did, was to mention that in 20 cities around the world, around the country, this is a true story, Domino's Pizza has donated money to the local government so they will pave potholes so that their drivers can more safely deliver pizza to your doorstep. Okay. Now, I believe it's debatable whether we should depend on Domino's for pizza, but it's certainly not debatable we should not depend on Domino's to pave the potholes in our country. In the greatest country in the world, we should have enough money to get to 60%. They estimated that GDP would grow by 7% over the period, and they estimated the debt to GDP ratio would fall to 17%, not 52. So there may be, if that's the case, the obvious thing to do is not impose some of the tax increases. All right, so there's obviously, these are 30-year forecasts, there's going to be some uncertainty. But to the extent that there have been estimates, they've actually been more favorable than the estimates I present in the book. So as I mentioned, the Penn-Wharton budget model has growth effects. I'm fairly certain these proposals would reduce inequality, increase mobility, And I do want to pat myself on the back in one way, regardless of whether you like the plan or not. It is an honest, hands above the table plan. There's no magic asterisk. Although I think it will increase growth, I don't use the growth effects in the revenue estimates. I think that's probably why Penn Wharton got the debt to GDP number so low. And importantly, the proposals I'm talking about are realistic reforms, right? There's no single payer health insurance that causes 175 million people to lose their current health insurance. There's no universal basic income that destroys the entire social safety net and replaces it with a payment system that's never been tried anywhere in the world. There's no wealth tax, which may not be constitutional. Okay, there's no flat tax, which again has never been implemented anywhere in the world. The reforms are things that people talk about, things that are on the shelf. That a value-added tax. 168 countries in the world have value-added tax. If Albania can administer a value-added tax, we can administer a value-added tax. So I view the conventional nature of the proposals as a feature, not a bug, in that it shows that given what we know, we can get where we need to go. We don't have to come up with some crazy radical solution to solve this problem. All right, so let me talk about three things real quick because I do want to get to your questions. One is the conservative critique of this, second is the liberal critique of this, and third is politics. All right, the conservative critique is that you got the problem right, but you got the solution wrong. The problem is too much debt, but the solution, you have too many taxes in there. That's going to destroy the economy. And I'm here to tell you that is not the case. I'll show you two graphs. One is the taxes and growth over US history. You divide US history into three periods: before the First World War, after the Second World War, and the time in the middle. You see tremendous growth in tax revenues over that period. Before the First World War, there was no income tax. Until very shortly before that, there was no estate tax, there's no corporate tax, there's no payroll tax. The taxes were like 2 or 3% of GDP from like the Civil War to World War I. Between the wars, there were more taxes, and then after the wars, we basically got our modern federal government, and taxes averaged 17% of GDP. So taxes went up by 15 percentage points of GDP. This is not 15%, this is 15 percentage points. That's like the total income tax and the total payroll tax put together, okay? And the per capita annual growth rate, real per capita annual growth rate, is basically the same in those three periods, right? And so when we debate about whether the top rate should be 39.6 or 37.0, it's useful that they say at one point we raised taxes by 15 percentage points of GDP and it had no impact on growth, all right? Now you might say, well, this was a long time ago, the economy's changed a lot, so let's look at cross-country evidence. This shows OECD country, G7 countries other than us, and this is all levels of government, not just federal. Their taxes are about a third as big as ours, but again, the growth rates are about the same. So I would argue that there is no prima facie evidence that raising revenues the way I would do it would hurt growth. And of course, the Penn Wharton budget model results help support that. Okay, what about the liberal critique? They say, well, you got the solution right, which is raise taxes on the rich and spend more on social policy, but you got the problem wrong, which is that their deficits are not really a problem. That's not really a problem because of low interest rates. And I guess what I'd say is a few things in response. One is the outlook already has low interest rates in it. They've adjusted down to corporate CBO's latest numbers, and we're still going off the charts. The second, there's this notion of a debt gamble, which is that we can borrow more now from we can borrow more from our kids, they can borrow more from their kids, and so on, and we can all be better off than otherwise. We can play this Ponzi game, which works until it doesn't work. And then if interest rates go up, then we're left not only with higher interest rates, but with more debt on top of it too. So we should realize that if we say we're going to ignore the debt because of low interest rates, that we're playing this gamble. And it may be optimal to play the gamble, it may not, but it's still a gamble. The other thing I'll just mention is that low interest rates make it harder to pre-fund Social Security and Medicare. To the extent we want to do that, lower interest rates will make it harder. All right, and then let me just show you if the, go to the last line here, the fiscal gap, if you start in 2021, you go to 2049, the 100% of GDP target required 2.8% of GDP. That is a 30% increase in income taxes. If you keep interest rates constant the next 30 years, if you assume that they're not going to rise at all, despite federal debt rising by 100 basis points, then the fiscal gap is 1.9% of GDP. That's about twice as big as the 2017 tax cut, and in the opposite direction. Okay. So it's still sizable. It's still sizable, and this is what interest payments look like, even if interest rates stay constant the next 30 years. So we'd still end up with the highest net interest payments in history. Okay. All right. So I think the conservative critique is totally wrong. I think the liberal critique is largely wrong. But open to questions. Last point is politics. Sooner or later, every discussion turns to, well, would they actually do anything like this? And I'll just mention this is a classic Mansur-Olson problem with concentrated costs. That is, somebody's taxes are going to go up, somebody's spending are going to go down. They're going to see it, and kind of ephemeral, diffuse benefits. Like you say, well, the economy is going to be stronger. Well, how are people going to identify that with particular fiscal policy changes? So, and then, of course, Olson says in that situation, the concentrated losers battle to oppose the policy, and the policy fails. And that's, I think, what we've seen. There's another way to look at it. There's a Hippocratic oath for doctors, which is do no harm. My colleague Charlie Schultz once said that it seems as if there's a Hippocratic oath for politicians, which is do no obvious harm. And so this would be doing obvious harm to some people to benefit other people, and that's a problem. Let me mention maybe a couple other things. One is the fact that the parties are partisan, infects everything, but it has a particularly egregious effect on fiscal policy solutions, because fiscal policy solutions will be enacted and implemented over time. You change Social Security benefits, you phase in Medicare reforms, you have a carbon tax, the tax rate goes up over time, so on. So the parties have to not only reach a deal, they have to trust each other that each party will let the deal go through. And nobody wants to be the sucker holding the bag while the other party's policies get implemented and your policies get canceled. The policymakers need to trust each other to not only enact a solution, but to implement a long-term solution. And that's a bigger haul than just being willing to reach an agreement. Lastly, I'll just mention a necessary but not sufficient condition to get this done is White House leadership. It is impossible to expect Congress, where everyone is enslaved to their local voters, it is possible to expect Congress to generate this type of solution. There's got to be the president going to the American people saying, this is a big deal, we're going to get this done, not everyone's going to get what they want, but overall the package is going to help all of us. The president needs to provide air cover, basically, for congressmen to talk about this. Oh, and lastly, it's got to be bipartisan, because there will be these ugly elements and each side wants to blame the other side for those. Okay. So I'm not a doom and gloomer, and I want to end on a couple of positive notes. One is, when you think about it, fiscal sustainability actually is consistent with both conservative and liberal goals. Conservatives want to not spend money the government doesn't have. Liberals want a strong and activist government, and that requires resources. That's only going to happen if the government pays, is fiscally responsible. And there's much to be gained from fiscal reform. Despite this Olson problem, The Olson problem doesn't say the gains aren't out there. It just says that the political system often accentuates the costs more than the gains. So there are two alternative paths we can take. One of them came up in a listening tour that Senator Max Baucus and Representative Dave Camp took a few years when they went to talk with taxpayers about, had town hall meetings about what they should do about tax reform. And one taxpayer said, you should get rid of all the deductions that don't affect me. And that would be nice, but that's how we got into this situation in the first place. And of course, we can't do that for everybody, or we would end up doing nothing. The other approach is sometimes attributed to Winston Churchill, but he never actually said it. And that's, you can always count on Americans to do the right thing after they have exhausted all of their other options. So I suspect that that is going to be more like the way history plays out. And I will leave you that as the most optimistic political forecast I can make. Good, so I'd be happy to take questions. I'm not sure. Yes?
One of your proposals had to do with the value-added tax. I see that as more regressive than progressive. How do you handle the progressiveness or regressiveness of a value-added tax?
All right, so the question is, isn't the value-added tax regressive, and why are you doing that? There's a couple of answers to that. One, it's not important that every component of the tax and spending system be progressive. It's only important that the overall system be progressive. Two, I don't think the value-added tax is as regressive as it's sometimes laid out. It's certainly more progressive than a payroll tax. And it imposes a one-time tax on existing wealth. If you think of where consumption is financed from, it's existing wealth and future wages, and then future monopoly profits as well. But consumption going forward is going to be financed from people's existing wealth and people's future wages. And so imposing a consumption tax is like imposing a lump sum tax on existing wealth. That's a very progressive component to a value-added tax. And existing wealth is huge. So that's like a 10% VAT a 10% consumption tax is a 10% tax on all existing wealth. It's a one-time lump sum implicit tax. A value-added tax does not quite reach that ideal because it exempts housing wealth. So it would be a one-time tax on non-housing wealth, which is still enormous. It's like $70 trillion in non-housing wealth in the country. So I think the value-added tax is more progressive, and I'm writing a paper on this, than people have thought than it traditionally is thought to be. Yes. Oh, I'm sorry. There's a third point too, which is you can use the value-added tax to finance progressive spending, which is what European countries do. They have much more social policy, family household spending, healthcare coverage, and that if you look at the difference between our system and theirs, they basically have a value-added tax that then finances those social initiatives, and that combination certainly is progressive. Because if you take a certain percentage of everyone's consumption and then give everyone a fixed income level, that's a very progressive change. Yes?
How do you feel about the fact that today's discussion is really still moving toward, I guess, the edges of the spectrum, in that on the Republican side, people are talking about further tax cuts, and on the Democratic side, people are talking about the wealth taxes, but they're not talking about the VAT or some of the other things you've talked about. It seems like we're not going for things that are realistic or pride.
Yeah, I'm actually impressed and happy that in a major campaign, major candidates, Warren and Sanders, are proposing substantial increases, tax increases. That normally doesn't happen, and it's 8 months ago, people were talking about modern monetary theory and how, oh, you can just go spend the money and don't worry about it. And Warren and Sanders have never said they don't endorse that, but by their actions, they are implying that they don't. I mean, you can imagine a liberal candidate saying, I'm going to do all this spending and I don't have to worry about financing it because interest rates are low or government prints its own money, so we don't have to worry about it. They're not saying that. They're saying we want to do all these things, and we're coming up with ways to pay for it. To me, that's a huge step forward. That's much better than saying, oh yeah, we want a tax cut and it'll pay for itself. So, yeah, Mark.
What is your analysis of MMT?
Oh, I think it's very convenient. It feels like liberal Laffer curve stuff to me. You know, you can spend the money and not have to worry about it. I think they're, just like the Laffer curve was right about a thing, that there is a tax rate above which tax revenues will go down. Theoretically, that's correct. Whether we're anywhere near that is what the debate's about, and I don't think we are. MMT is right about a certain thing too, which is that because we print our own currency, we can never literally go bankrupt. We could always print more currency. The response though is, so what? You can do an enormous amount of damage before you get there. The whole gradual scenario is about what happens way, way, way before you get to the point where you have to print money to avoid default. So I think they're technically correct on that one point. I mean, I actually learned that point as an undergraduate, and I just don't find it very relevant to the fiscal policy issues. Yes?
One intervention that you didn't discuss was, I'll call it demographic intervention. Leaving to one side Jonathan Swift type intervention. Obviously, there's periodic discussion about the potential positive benefit from significant increases in immigration. I wonder what you think about that, what the order of magnitude of impact or something like that.
Yeah, I think you're right on several scores. One, this is an important issue. Two, I left it out in the book. Three, it would help. And I think, you know, our immigration policy stands to be improved in a number of ways. I think it would definitely help noticeably. It would not solve the problem unless we did something completely off the scale, but it certainly would help. And one of the problems in writing the book is there's 4 spending chapters, there's 4 tax chapters. It could very easily have turned into a book about everything. And I had to make some cuts about what I didn't talk about. Immigration was the hardest cut, basically. I think it's a very important issue, both morally and economically, and it could help the fiscal situation.